Goed, dan gaan we door naar onze volgende 2 sprekers. Dat gaan we in het Engels doen. Het komt namelijk van de organisatie, de Duitse organisatie Fair Mieten, Wonen. Ik vraag uw aandacht voor Dr. Christiane Droste en Alexander Thom.
Good afternoon from Berlin, and thank you very much for the invitation and enabling us, all of us, to have this seminar despite the COVID-19 restrictions to meet in real life. I'm the coordinator of the Fair Renting, Fair Living, Berlin's Competence and Advice Center Against Discrimination on the Housing Market, and we will give this presentation with support, and I will give this presentation with support of my colleague Alexander Thom, who is amongst other responsible for the testings we have done so far. The objective of our presentation is to share with you the political and legal background of the project, give you some insight in the focus and instruments of our work, and last but not least, reflect the effects of our work. Alexander will introduce you to a court sentence against Deutsche Wohnen, one of the biggest landlords in Germany, a case that has been accompanied by our counseling unit. So, and this is the point to start the presentation. For the political and legal background, I'd just like to introduce briefly that the project exists since July 2017 and is funded by the City-State's Ministry for Justice, Consumer Protection and Anti-Discrimination. Berlin is so far the only state in Germany that has a ministry department for anti-discrimination. Its strategies and projects are developed and steered by a sub-department, the State Office for Equal Treatment and Against Discrimination. The anti-discrimination policy in Berlin is based on 2 laws. This is, on the one hand, the General Equal Treatment Act that addresses discrimination in mass business, including housing, to be pursued in the civil law context and is based on European legislation. Most of you will know about this. Severe criticism is formulated by all anti-discrimination actors concerning this law, because the law can only work if a landlord has more than 49 flats and allows misinterpretation concerning social ethnic mix. This reduced number of flats, being a kind of limit, a barrier to the law being enacted, is so far important to know, because the Berlin housing market is dominated by small private landlords. So most of the landlords can't be pursued by this law. The law protects in case of discrimination related to ethnic origin, gender, religion, belief, disability, age, sexual orientation, so is linked to the European legislation. However, there are several reasons for discrimination that are not protected by this law, but often reason for discrimination as far as we observe it. This is, on the one hand, social situation and income. It is also household structure and family structure. A good example are the refugees, often living in bigger families, but also other immigrant communities. And we have the problem of language. Language is quite often a reason for discrimination, and there's only hardly a way to be protected by this law if there is not an intersectional relation in terms of discrimination that is linked to ethnic origin. The second law is a very new law, the Berlin State Anti-Discrimination Act, addressing discrimination by public administration, whereas the first law is addressing cases to be dealt with in civil law, and only individuals and private actors. We have here now an instrument to work with, how you want to put it, public administration. But again, the law or the act is a bit weak concerning the field of housing, because the only way to protect people discriminated by public administration, or the only field to protect them, is in the social housing departments. That is where, for example, housing benefit, housing allowances are being administrated. The public housing companies, in contrast, can hardly be affected to this law because they have a private legal status as actors, housing actors. So they could only be addressed through the supervisory boards, in which you will find also the Berlin state representatives. Last but not least, we have a strong, as most European metropolitan areas, housing deficit in the sector of affordable housing. So that strengthens the competition, and the concurrence between vulnerable groups on the housing market. At the same time, we have a left-wing housing political context that produces a strong demand on social housing, on anti-discrimination policies also in housing. The Berlin Advice Center is so far the only anti-discrimination agency or advice center working exclusively in the field of housing discrimination in Germany. It's carried out by two actors with responsibility for their fields of action within the advice center. You see on the slide the structure of our project. So UP19, our office, is a private agency for urban research and projects working since 2006 with a focus on gender and diversity. The second actor is the NGO Turkish Association in Berlin-Brandenburg, a human rights organization, but focusing on Turkish populations. And these two actors reflect the double strategy of the project, and at the same time a big challenge. Strategy and networking needs dialogue, sometimes compromise, to change the cultures of renting out, to build awareness on the forms, the structures of discrimination and also its effects. Sometimes it needs compromise to change the cultures of renting out, as I said. In contrast, our counseling unit strictly follows the standards of anti-discrimination counseling. And that is to say, it has to be partisan for persons feeling affected by discrimination. If you look at the structure that is shown on the slide, you see that we have some tasks on which we work together, and some tasks that are exclusively dealt with by one of the partners. And you see the TBB, the Turkish Association, does the counseling for those affected exclusively, for example, and we have kind of the lead in the development of the model Berlin Rents Out Fair, but there are of course many fields of action where we have to cooperate. We do also have not a legal cooperation, but a kind of informal cooperation with the biggest Berlin Tenants Association, the Berliner Mieterverein. You have a broad, from the beginning, having a broad dissemination of our work through also in the housing initiatives and housing policy, housing law field. The unit that works in the field of counseling addresses or has target groups mainly in the field of the persons that are affected by discrimination, and they receive counseling in a personal and empathic way. It's confidential, if desired, it's anonymous. And I think the most important criterion in their work is really being partisan and empowering. And they do not only counseling, but they do also accompaniment in legal actions. Legal actions do happen rarely. We have so far had about 300 cases where people demanded for counseling, but only very, very few cases where we could accompany people to court. Even in mediation processes, which the unit for counseling does as well, they remain partisan, and the counseling of all other actors in cooperation with the Unit for Strategy and Networking, that is us, is addressing public administration, housing and service providers, housing actors, umbrella organizations, and above all, of course, actors from civil society initiatives that work in anti-discrimination. This is a very specific approach because usually anti-discrimination initiatives or works or projects, actors don't get into dialogue, don't get into negotiations with the people causing discrimination. Our strategic work is based on, let's say, 5 columns. This is the advisory board. The advisory board brings together those representatives of people or groups in society that often have to face discrimination. It brings them together with housing actors. It brings them together with public administration, with umbrella organizations of the housing market, of housing actors. So again, we have a dialogue between those whom we could name like aggressors and those who try to empower people, to try to help them to get their rights, their right on equal treatment on the housing market. We have developed a documentation system to have also, on the one hand, visibility of cases, on the other hand, the aggregation of data in order to provide a better basis for political action. We do a lot of expert dialogues on the situation of specific groups being often discriminated on the housing markets, and we provide seminars to all the actors to whom we provide also counseling, and who are in part partners, cooperating institutions to raise more sensitivity and awareness about discrimination and how to combat it. Also, we have a number of publications, both in terms of knowledge transfer, target group orientated, and providing manuals in anti-discrimination work. Our big project since 2 years is to develop a model, Berlin Rents Out Fair, which we hope to be accepted by as many landlords as possible. By the end of the year, we will start publishing it, hopefully in November. It has been built throughout a participative process with all the actors in our advisory board and with several other groups in civic society. It was a difficult situation to negotiate in the end with the Senate and landlords and anti-discrimination actors on the text. Actually, there are 9 guidelines how to prevent, how to avoid discrimination. This goes in many fields, like how to advertise flats, how to build awareness in a housing company or for a single landlord, what is discrimination, where does it happen, how can he or she combat it, and so on. So it had to be, on the one hand, a model that can still, in quotation marks, be accepted by those who usually are the discriminators. But on the other hand, it has to be a strong kind of text, accepted also by all the initiatives, all the anti-discrimination agencies, to keep it reliable, to keep it really an instrument that shows that a landlord is willing to change his culture of renting out. So sometimes we reach limits of dialogue, for example, when we discuss the wording of these guidelines, and words like transparency on letting processes were not so welcomed by the landlords. On the other hand, transparency is a key issue in discussing fair letting or fair renting out. So we really insisted on keeping this. Yeah. And now the question is how to implement it. On the one hand, how to get people to sign this kind of model, and on the other hand, we will provide a lot of ideas and tools how one landlord, and the diversity of landlords we do have in Berlin, can implement this model in their context. The next slide will show the 9 guidelines, but you won't have time to read it. I will just go over this. You can read it afterwards, and I would just like to focus or to emphasize that one, or the very big issue and important issue, is to increase the visibility of, on the one hand, the happening of discrimination, on the other hand, the instruments we have against discrimination. And one very important instrument, an insight on a very important instrument that we used, the testing, is now presented by Alex, and I'll give the floor to him.
Yeah, thank you. In the next minutes, I would like to address 2 forms of testings that we use as tools for anti-discriminatory work. The first is in response to people being affected by discrimination, coming to us for counseling and support. And the second way, we use it as a way to further the understanding of the process of renting and exclusion and influencing the public and scientific discourse. Testings can, and that is gaining more and more traction in Germany, be used in legal procedures. In late 2019 and until beginning 2020, we supported a person who was unlawfully excluded from visiting an offered flat for inspection and renting. After a long search for a flat and only very little positive responses from landlords, the affected person suspected that part of the rejections were only because of his last name of Turkish heritage. He decided to investigate further, and after one message from Deutsche Wohnen, which we already heard is one of the largest landlords in Germany, he got the message that the flat he wanted to visit was already rented to someone else and not be able to rent it for him. He asked a friend of his to call and apply for the same flat with all the same data that he gave, but the one difference was the very German-sounding name he used. The result was that the flat suddenly was available again, and an appointment for inspection was offered. The affected person documented the process, came to us for counseling, and finally filed a lawsuit. The tests they made, these testing procedures, are based on the anti-discriminatory law, which state that you can't deny anyone something that is publicly for sale based on race, gender, sexuality, age, disabilities, religion, or class. That testing in the end was pivotal for the judge's decision in favor of the plaintiff and against Deutsche Wohnen. Deutsche Wohnen was sentenced to a 3,000 euro fine, which is a rather low amount for a corporation which had in 2019 a turnover of more than €1 billion. So while the verdict made clear what is wrong and what is right before the lawsuit had supposedly little effect on the corporation being sued. At the same time, there started a campaign that is resonating quite well in Berlin, calling for expropriation of the biggest landlords, which one of them is Deutsche Wohnen. That could be seen as a certain pressure being put on Deutsche Wohnen brought forth a marketing effort that placed fairness in renting at the core of the Deutsche Wohnen branding, which all in all may be a hint that with new needs to legitimize certain forms of renting flats as a huge corporation comes as well new interest in fair and discriminatory-free forms of distribution of flats. Another sign of this ambiguous behavior and relationship to fairness and discrimination is that representatives of Deutsche Wohnen often visit our workshops and events, but never really show any binding commitment. As a support for these kinds of testings, we made as support of this kind of testings, we made it easy, and to make it easier for counselors and people being affected, we developed a short guide with fill-out forms to do testings via mail or telephone in order to test if certain categories may have had played a role in the application for a certain flat. Another form of testings are the scientific testings that do not try to prove any one specific case, but apply for a large amount of flats with a small number of predefined identities, and then analyze if differences in age, gender, race, etc. have an influence on the responses from landlords. We realized 2 of these scientific testings. One was focusing on big families, the other one on single mothers, both applying for the flats by mail and then analyzing the responses. While that is a very important field of research, we do sadly enough not have the results to take the next steps that would be necessary. It would be very interesting to explore the election process and face-to-face interactions, because testings by mail and telephone bring fewer and fewer results as corporations and landlords get accustomed to these forms of studies, get accustomed to rulings in court, and push the selection of who gets the flat and who doesn't further and further in the process of applying.
So to come to the end, which visions or instruments do we have to support better access or more equal access to housing? One very important issue is that the division of the housing market is a key barrier. So the publicly owned part of the market, where we have some opportunities to steer the renting out processes, versus the, in Germany, very, very big private housing market, where we have difficulties to get through with any kind of legal processes. So we have really to work on motivating them to change their cultures. An important aspect, the structural aspect, is of course the prevention of housing discrimination through the diversity of the housing offer. That is not to say not only in terms of affordability, but also in terms of like big and small flats, like flexible ground floors, like different building structures, cooperative housing, community-oriented housing, so on, to meet the different needs in housing, notably and particularly of those who are vulnerable groups on the housing market. It's very important, it remains important to raise awareness for the forms and typologies of discrimination, that is structural discrimination, like for example, the structure of the housing market and housing stock, and individual forms of discrimination, direct forms of discrimination by, for example, people working in the housing companies, renting out, like the gatekeepers. In Germany, we need more strengthening of the anti-discrimination work, specifically in housing. And we need, for sure, a revision of the anti-discrimination, the general Anti-Discrimination Act. And to make a last statement on the risk of discrimination in housing in Germany, and I think all over Europe, is that the housing shortage increases the risk of discrimination and also the increasing competition of vulnerable groups on the housing market. The long-term pressure on the affordable housing market, above all in the metropolitan areas, requires thus political strategies and alliances to provide housing for vulnerable groups and housing offers that are diverse, as I said, in forms of typology and affordability. These strategies would help to avoid discrimination and can be supported by instruments of anti-discrimination policies like the ones we presented, and notably this opportunity to use course sentences that has been successful in the court as examples to how to combat discrimination or to pursue discrimination actions.
Ja, we zijn weer terug in de studio en we hebben zojuist geluisterd naar het zeer inspirerende, uitgebreide verhaal van dokter Christiane en Alexander. Over hun Berlijnse aanpak in Duitsland van de organisatie Fair Mieten, Wonen.